But I just wanted to sort of give a quick introduction to everyone who's here. So my name is Francisca. I am a senior advisor for safeguarding at Bond, which is the UK network of civil society organisations. And in my role at Bond, I support CSOs with improving their safeguarding practice, so doing better safeguarding within organisations. And today I'm joined by my wonderful co-conveners, Sally, Francis, and Marcus. And you may have seen on the programme that we were also expecting to have Tundi Giwa on our panel today as well. We're really keen to have some different perspectives, so not only perspectives from for white Europeans on this panel, especially as we're speaking about development and about sort of culture and leadership in that space. So we're very keen to bring in a view that is other than our own. Unfortunately, Tunde wasn't able to join us today at the last minute, so it's just us, unfortunately, though hopefully nonetheless interesting for everyone. I guess one thing to say before we properly start with the panel, if technology fails us, please bear with us. We're just starting our way around, haven't used the platform before, and I'm sure you've seen that in other panels as well. So just bear with us if something gets stuck or if we're a little bit more slow than we would be normally. But hopefully you've been able to sort of familiarize yourselves with the platform over the last couple of days. Just wanted to also mention that as a reminder, the session will be recorded and it'll be available on the DSA website afterwards. We have about 90 minutes. I don't know whether we'll need the full 90 minutes if we're just a small group, but we can see how we get on. And we'll run it sort of as a panel discussion. So we'll hear from all of the speakers first. We'll hear from Francis first, we'll hear from Marcus, and then from Sally. And then we'll have an opportunity for some questions and answers from everyone in the audience. That's how we set it out. Because we're so few people, perhaps we could also just have a little bit more of a conversation rather than a formal Q&A, but we can see how we get on. So just to say why we're here, over the last year and a bit, I would say, our three panelists have worked together to develop a practical tool for leaders, particularly for NGOs, but not exclusively so, to understand and improve the safeguarding culture within their organizations. So we want to use what we have learned by developing the tool in this session and to explore a little bit what it means to have a safe culture within an organization, what that looks like, the role that people in power play, both in creating a safe culture, but also in modeling that culture. And also a little bit sort of thinking about culture and that's something that is actually quite fuzzy, how that can be assessed within an organization and how you can sort of think about whether you're doing it right or not. And in terms of what you'll hear, so you'll first hear from Francis, and Francis will speak a little bit about how the work has come about and why we focused on this work and sort of reasoning behind that. And then we'll hear from Marcus, who will speak a little bit about what safeguarding and safe cultures actually mean. And then last we'll hear from Sally, who will speak a little bit more about how you can create a safe culture in organizations and sort of why organizations fail in creating a safe culture. If you do have any questions throughout, you can raise your hand or you can type a question just in the type question box and we will pick that up in the Q&A. So thank you very much for Francis. I don't know if you all wanted to introduce yourselves first, perhaps, or say a quick word about who you are before we start, and then I can set up Francis' presentation. Does that work for everyone?
Sure.
Perfect. Perfect. Maybe Francis, you just go first.
Okay, fantastic. Thanks so much, Francisca. So I'm Frances Longley. I'm the Executive Director for Programmes and Policy at Care International UK. And along with Sally, I co-chair the NGO Working Group on Leadership and Culture for Safeguarding.
I'm Marcus Zaruga. I'm an independent safeguarding consultant, and I have a specific interest in organisational safeguarding. So I've published about that, I've done research on that, and I consult with organisations about how their organisational safeguarding is functioning and potentially point out or try and explore with them ways in which it can be improved.
And hi, I'm Sally Proudlove. I'm the head of safeguarding at UNICEF UK, and I've been working with Francis and others to develop these tools. I've got a particular interest in how we enable organisations to really fulfil their safeguarding responsibilities, and how we make sure that we really live and breathe safeguarding in our organisational culture.
Great, thank you all. So I'm gonna bring up your presentation now, Francis, and Sally and Marcus, you're just going to go back into the audience. So just bear with me while I do that.
Great, thanks, Francisca. So good to be here and good to have a group where we can have a discussion. So I'm going to start just by setting the scene a little bit and just reminding us all how we got to this place. So many of us will remember 2 years ago now, back in February 2018, the Times broke a story about Oxfam staff and sexual exploitation and abuse in Haiti. And shortly after that, there was another story which was about Save the Children, which was actually focused much more on their UK office and of senior staff covering up and perpetuating sexual harassment and bullying. Both those organisations have since been investigated by the Charity Commission, and they've undertaken detailed internal programmes of change. At the time, back in February of 2018, the UK government's Department for International Development responded very strongly to the stories and launched a very public, very critical response and demanded comprehensive improvement across the whole of the NGO sector. And this was a point when I think many of us took a long, hard look at our organisations, and I think the public really faced a bit of a crisis of trust in us as well. Back in March 2018, the Secretary of State for International Development called a one-day summit, which was attended by senior NGO representatives. And out of that, a series of commitments were made. And from those commitments, Bond, DFID, and the Charity Commission jointly arranged to convene working groups, which would tackle key aspects of those commitments. So there were 4 NGO working groups formed, and they were set up to address the employment cycle, reporting and complaints, good governance for trustees, and the role of leadership and culture in making organisations safe. And as I mentioned, Sally and I co-chair that last group on leadership and culture. So moving on to what's changed since February 2018, that really was a seismic shock for us. And all of us, I think, I think pretty much every organisation had to take a very serious look at its policies and at its practice. And so what actually many of us discovered is that there was quite a range of policy and practice going on across the sector. Some organisations were already quite well ahead, had some good provision in place. Some realised that really they had some quite big gaps. So collaboratively as a sector, we've worked together to try and bring everybody up to a good enough standard, and also to set ourselves ambitious targets to really have a high level of excellence in safeguarding. And in that context, safeguarding has developed a new definition, really, which encompasses not only protection of vulnerable adults and children, but it's also protection from bullying, from harassment, as well as from sexual exploitation and abuse within our organisations and in terms of what we do to others as organisations. It is a very broad definition now within our sector. As a result of commitments made, we established through Bond a commitment document, which has got 12 overarching commitments in it across all areas of safeguarding. And that's all underpinned by actions. And we have, as a sector, been responding to those commitments and working out how we can honour those. So as a quick snapshot, we did some survey work, Bond did some survey work last year, and members explained that one of the changes that had happened had been in resourcing. So 74% had increased resources around safeguarding. since February 2018. So that shows a huge level of response across the sector. 72% had increased board agenda time, but 55% still didn't have a complete full-time post dedicated to safeguarding. The other thing that we looked at was about staff time and training. So 93% had committed more staff time to safeguarding. I don't think that would be a surprise to anybody who's been working in the sector. We have all been spending significantly more time thinking about this area. As it says here, 76% had increased safeguarding training, which is fantastic, and nearly 60% had increased the budget spent on safeguarding. All of that is fantastic. However, what we also know is that actually just having the policies, having the training, having the conversations is not enough. And so the work of the group, which Sally and I have been co-chairing, has really focused on the overarching role of culture and leadership. Because what we know, and as Marcus and Sally will also go on to speak about, is that you can have all of the policies and the training in place that you like, but actually if you don't have the right leadership and the right culture, then you won't have anything other than just basic compliance. There will be enormous gaps. It is not enough just to tick boxes. So what was important about the work that our group did is that it sits alongside and complements the work that the other three working groups developed. So that this is in effect the kind of umbrella that sits across to make sure that actually the policies and the processes and the different ways of working have the right environment within which to thrive and be maintained. So when we talk about culture, it can feel a little nebulous. And what we wanted to do was develop a tool which leaders and organizations could use. And they can use that in order to assess their own culture to see whether it is healthy and it is there and is going to be promoting and championing safeguarding. But they can also use that then as a tool to develop. So you can get a baseline, but you can also understand more about what you need to change and how you need to change as a leader and as an organization. Sally will talk about this in more detail, but just to give a snapshot, the way that we developed the tool was to bring together a team of specialists who worked on this. And within that group, we had survivor representation, we had development and humanitarian expertise, gender-based violence expertise, safeguarding expertise, and safeguarding culture expertise. We also had specialists in human resources. And what we set out to do was to build on existing sector standards and resources. We didn't want to reinvent things which already existed and were strong. We wanted to gather insights from field staff and people on the front line, and we then wanted to understand and articulate the difference between compliance and culture. So the tool that we've developed spells out behaviours. It talks about what leaders need to do to demonstrate the healthy culture, to role model good behaviour and encourage really effective safeguarding cultures within their organisations, and also to challenge unhealthy cultures. That's a really important part of leadership. Having been a chief executive of an NGO myself and still in a very senior leadership role in a large NGO, I know one of my responsibilities is about challenging the wrong behaviour, as well as trying to role model the right behaviour. So we've developed a tool. In the next few months, we will be launching it online. And we are in the process of testing what we've created. And that will be the most tangible output, I think, of the group that I've been co-chairing. But I think the other part of what we've done is really try to spark a conversation across the sector about culture and about leadership. And by explaining its importance in terms of safeguarding, what we're hoping to do is really encourage a revolution in terms of how our cultures develop and how they're maintained across the whole sector. Thanks very much.
Presentation and handover, so sorry for the small glitch. Really useful overview of what we've been doing with the group. I'm just now adding Marcus to come onto the podium and to load his presentation as well. So just one moment, please. Great, Marcus, over to you now. I'll just make it bigger and then you can go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, is that okay? Okay, well, pleasure to be with you. And Thank you, Francis. That was really helpful introduction. And I would just say ahead of my presentation that I was really excited to be part of the group that was developing this tool, not least because when I've been going into organizations and trying to think with leadership teams about what they can tangibly do and how they can tangibly measure the impact of the culture and how it relates to safeguarding in their organization, there really hasn't been anything. So it was really encouraging to have the opportunity to contribute to creating that. And also interesting for us, or I certainly found it interesting, to grapple with actually what were tangible indicators. We kind of knew what the top lines were, but it was really helpful to have to drill down. So when Sally comes to talk about the tool itself, I hope you'll see that reflected. So my job is to, as you can see from the section outline, to talk about definitions so that we're clear that we're all talking about the same thing, to say something about the power of organizational culture, and then to offer you some a signpost to a piece of work on standards for a safer organizational culture. And I've got 10 minutes to do that. So it rather occurred to me, thank you, that a good analogy was that it'll be a bit like a river. It'll be wide-ranging, not very deep, and I'm going to be going fast. I've also broken the cardinal rule of presentations in that some of my slides are really rather busy, like this one. And I'm really not going to try and read them out. You'll be grateful to hear. But equally, the reason that they're there is so that afterwards, if you want to go back and refer to some of the detail of what's on the slide, it's there for you. So hopefully you'll find that useful. So in terms of definitions, in the UK, we use safeguarding as a very broad definition that, as you can see in the bits I've highlighted in blue, relate to health and well-being and human rights of all individuals, but especially those who are particularly potentially vulnerable. And child protection then is the next layer down, where it focuses specifically on those who might be at serious risk of harm. So as you can see, the title of this panel was about better safeguarding. So we were taking it in the very broadest terms. But I was struck that UNICEF uses child protection in the same way that we tend to use safeguarding. So it seemed important that we drew the distinction about the way in which we are using the term safeguarding. Next one, please, Francisca. Again, important to have some definitions of organizational culture, and there are a whole range of really very useful and helpful definitions of organizational culture like this one. However, the one that I find most useful, next one please. Francisca, the next one please. Thank you. Is this one, which is actually from an unlikely source, the Health and Safety Executive in the UK. But it's this notion that culture, whatever the organization aspires to or has in its mission statement, is actually the way things get done. And the way that one actually finds out what the organizational culture is by actually looking at what are the actions of the people who form a part of that. And that crucially, I really quite like this next thing, that culture is the context that people use to judge whether their behavior is appropriate or not. So they're checking out, what does this organization usually do, and therefore what's okay for me to do. And that has a huge influence on the way people behave and the way they perform. And what's really striking, or I found it quite striking, can you go back one, Francisca? No, just one on, thank you. What I found really striking was some work I came across that talked about the power of organizational culture, because I think I had assumed generally that if the organizational culture is unhealthy or becomes corrupted in some way, that people who don't want to behave in that way will be able to continue keeping to their own moral standards and their own expectations. Next one, please. Frank, thank you. But this article that I came across, I thought really helpfully set out something of the dynamic of what can happen to people who are trying to do that. So what they suggest is that if one wants to comply with one's own moral standards in an organisation where that isn't necessarily the prevailing culture, then that requires individuals to actively resist that, and that active resistance actually consumes what they refer to as self-regulatory resources. It takes an increasing effort to continue to behave in the way that we think is right in an organisation where that's not the prevailing culture, and that across time, those resources in the individual may become depleted. And what they go on to suggest is that if somebody's own standards and ethics are in contradiction to those that are prevailing in the organisation or in part of the organisation, because organisations very often, organisational culture is in pockets rather than completely the same across an organisation, that they will in a relatively short time either begin to comply or will choose to leave. And turnover rates are actually sometimes quite an interesting indication of what is the organisational culture and how far are people finding that dissonant with their own standards. Next one, please. Francis referred to some of the crises that have occurred in the aid sector in the UK. And I've particularly just put these three examples up here because they were ones that were deeply shocking to those of us that don't work in the NGO sector. I think what was deeply shocking was that certainly in the UK, these were regarded as not-for-profits that were the good guys. These were the people that are ethically driven rather than profit driven. And therefore, I certainly rather assumed that they would be the people that had healthy organisational cultures. And yet in very different ways, it turned out that that was not the case. And I think possibly the most striking one, or no, they're all startling in different ways. But I thought the Amnesty International example where they had 2 staff suicides, and that led to a review of the organisational culture, and found really surprisingly, you can see, 1/3 of employees felt they were badly treated or bullied at work, and that the organisational culture and management failures were at the root cause of most staff wellbeing issues, the opposite of what one would expect at Amnesty. And it was striking that in that report, as very often in organisations where these things occur, senior managers really did not have an understanding of the organisational culture that they were presiding over, because their bubble of experience didn't reflect that. So finally, thank you. You may be familiar with the Australian Royal Commission that was convened to look at institutional responses to child sexual abuse. If not, then it's very much like the child sexual abuse inquiry that's going on in the UK at the moment, in as much as they looked at specific settings and case studies so that they had specific material, but also commissioned research. And what you've got there is the outcome of one piece of research that they did about what were organisational standards that can make institutions safer for children by having a safer culture. And those 10 bullet points are, if you like, the sort of tip of the summary of a much bigger piece of research. And if you look on their website, then you can read the research that actually shows what they consider to underpin those standards. But working to get that there. Looks like it. Oh, thank you. It's the same slide. It's just that I thought that the one that was particularly relevant is this notion that child safety is embedded in institutional leadership, governance and culture. And that's certainly what we focused on when we developed the tool. Even if that's their aspiration, how far is that played out in practice? And what can they do to ensure that is the primary, or one of the primary things that their organisation is focused on? So thank you very much. Back to you, Francisca.
Thank you, Marcus. Really interesting, and I think especially what you said about the power of culture was really insightful. So thank you very much. So just bear with me as I ask Sally to come up here. Just loading your presentation, Sally, and then I'll hand over to you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Francisca. So it's lovely to be here with everybody. Thank you very much to Marcus and Francis already for setting the scene. So what I'm just going to do is talk you through some of the things that I think we've learned through the development of this tool. Just to reiterate, really, we really wanted to produce something that would be practical and useful for organisations. The conversation and narrative that has gone on around the safeguarding crisis has very much included talk about culture, the failings in some of the organisations that were described, and they are often in organisations, not just those, but in other organisations where there are significant failures of practice. They're very often not about policy and procedure. What they're about is cultural behaviour within organisations, the kind of things that are allowed to happen, the kind of things that are just a kind of a given in terms of the way that people behave. And that for Oxfam and for Save the Children, they had lots of policy and procedure. It wasn't about that essentially. It was about the culture that enabled that procedure to be a really living, breathing thing that made a difference or not. So what we did, I think Francis has already mentioned that we started with a working group. You can see there, just to reiterate, the kind of representation we had in the group. And what we particularly wanted to do was to look at the existing standards and resources. So we didn't want to do this in a vacuum. We wanted to really think about what this was going to mean on the front line. So we were both thinking about organisations where they are headquartered in big capital cities like London, for example, but also where people are operating in a really wide range of settings. So we've got emergency settings and other development settings, where there are particular focuses and challenges that need to be addressed. We really wanted to try and articulate, sorry, just to go back again, Francisca, please, the difference between compliance and culture, which I will come on to in a second. We wanted to create a really useful tool that people could put into practice. And we've ended up developing a series of slides as well that can be used throughout the organisation. So moving on, we looked at serious case reviews. We spoke to people that were operating in the field, and we wanted to really think about what does this mean in practice in terms of this kind of slippery concept of culture with regards to safeguarding in our sector. And what we wanted to be able to articulate was what would it look like if we had an explicit safeguarding culture and ethos with values and behaviours that are articulated but also lived and breathed at all the different levels of an organisation. And we really wanted to think about how do we help organisations to develop a culture where people are curious, where there's scrutiny, and where there's a real constructive challenge. So in order to try and do this in practice, we developed a new interactive tool, and we wanted that to really do a number of things. So we've developed something that will focus particularly on leadership, and I'll talk us through what we've kind of included in that in a second. But also we wanted it to develop a plan that organisations could really work to. We know that the conversation about culture is only one part of what we want organisations to do. We want organisations and leadership, particularly in organisations, to see that this is a long-term change over time that's needed. And in order to keep that going, we needed to have something that was written into a concrete plan with clear actions. So in terms of designing the leadership tool, what we ended up doing was thinking about this in kind of three sections. And we based it on the core humanitarian standards. So we know that there are already existing frameworks that speak into this space and that would enable us to have a structure. So we use the same headings and the same kind of categories as in that the core humanitarian standards. And then what we did under each of those was to think, okay, so in different themes, what would we be looking for if we were to identify the behaviours that would indicate really good, strong safeguarding culture? So what you'll see here is we developed cultural indicators, so things that we would expect organisations to exhibit, and particularly we were focusing around at this stage leadership. And then we wanted to really challenge leaders to think about whether they were doing this in practice, because it would be very easy for leadership to just look at the cultural indicator and say, yeah, we're doing that already. We think we're pretty good at this and we can just tick that box. So then we wanted to have some challenging questions, and then following on from that, some actions for how that could be built upon and how that could be developed further. So we recognise that there were limits to just having a tool that internally organisations could reflect upon. And the other thing that we wanted to build in was the possibility that organisations might look for some external facilitation for this, so that they really could be challenged to provide evidence against these different cultural indicators. And so the tool that we developed is still in development actually now, but what we've ended up with is a whole series of questions and a whole series of indicators that organisations can use both to reflect upon the culture that they feel is existing now in the organisation, but also to think about how that can be changed. And that information will then be fed into, through a digital tool, a plan that organisations can then print off and share and have other parts of the organisation feeding into. So it should be a really useful exercise for organisations to go through, so that they then have something concrete that they can follow. And some of what we wanted to think about when we were developing this and to address is really, why does safeguarding fail in organisations? And this has really been some of the learning that we've had through the development of this tool and through the piloting of it with a range of organisations who have looked at this for us and said, this is the kind of learning for us in this space. And I think there are a number of reasons, and I'm just going to highlight a few of those now. So I think one of the key things we've learned is that very often organisations have a failure to understand the difference between compliance and culture. What we were able to produce through our work on this tool was a series of slides. This is just one example of one in the theme of policies and procedures. And we were able to really map the journey that an organisation might take in terms of behaviours that you might see in that organisation, from a space that you might describe as non-compliance into minimal compliance, or you could even just refer to that as compliance, into an effective safeguarding culture. And what we found was that when we challenged organisations to describe their safeguarding culture, they would often use phrases or behaviours, descriptions that were really more in the compliance space. So, for example, an organisation might say, everybody in our organisation completes safeguarding training, which is a really good thing. We would encourage people to do that. But really, that's a compliance statement. And what we would want to look at more in the conversation about culture is, what difference has that training made? How have you seen the impact of that training? What impact is that having on the way that staff are engaging with the topic of safeguarding, and the extent to which it is becoming a proactive part of everything that we do, as opposed to something that just needs to be kind of ticked off. So yeah, we can move on to the next one, Francisca. Thank you. So secondly, I think we wanted to highlight that there's very often a failure of leadership. We were particularly focused in the tool that we developed on leaders because we really understand that it has to be led from the top. Very often safeguarding can be pushed from the bottom up, and that is one way to bring about change. You can do it both ways, but it is exhausting, and really it is a much more effective way to lead in best safeguarding practice if leaders really understand their duty of care and their responsibility. So we thought about the different ways in which senior leaders impact culture. This isn't an exhaustive list, but these were some of the things that we reflected on and that we felt we learned through the production of the tool. The extent to which words and deeds match, and how leaders handle it when they don't. The way in which we're seen to handle failure, the extent to which leaders have a genuine humility and an ability to learn and to listen really well to people throughout their organisation, not just the people in the executive team. the relationship between values and behaviours. So one of the things that we have seen is that where there have been these real significant breakdowns in safeguarding in organisations, very often people have signed a code of conduct that has listed out the very behaviours that they have then gone on to exhibit, and they have caused the breakdown in safeguarding and breakdown in practice, and where people have been harmed. So it's about the extent to which we join up our values and the values of the organisation with our behaviours. The way in which we interact and our relationships with other senior managers are experienced by the wider organisation. So, you know, where there are kind of healthy relationships in senior leadership teams. The decisions about who is hired and fired, and we've really just highlighted this one because one of the key issues that came up in the crisis was the issue about how people were being kind of moved around in the development community, where there were clearly concerns about them, but also the extent to which people were given jobs because they knew senior leaders in the organisation, and there wasn't a robust process. And recruitment is one of the ways we really can keep the wrong people out of our sector. Decisions about who's valued and rewarded, and particularly an issue around what's championed and prioritised. Is safeguarding and are these values-led issues really championed within the organisation? The next really key issue is around the failure to relinquish power. One of the things that has been a constant kind of word throughout my career, which I've been involved in for 20 years now, is this issue of empowerment. And what we really wanted to highlight was that we feel that one of the things that's been highlighted here is that really we've never got to grips with what we mean by empowerment. And for genuine empowerment to take place, some degree of existing power needs to be relinquished. And interestingly, these are also some of the conversations that I think we're revisiting again now through the anti-racist movement that we're seeing in the light of the Black Lives Matter protests, and actually for us to talk again about this issue of power, that everybody can't have the same amount of power. We've got to relinquish some of the power that those of us in power have got in order to enable other people to share in that power. And I think that has been one of the challenges in our sector, and particularly around the issue of safeguarding. We're also concerned that there can be a failure of focus. And what we mean by that is that there has been a tendency for us to only talk about the really serious end of safeguarding. And that's because those are the things that are most shocking. Those were some of the issues that came out in the inquiries and in the concerns that led to the safeguarding crisis in February 2018. But actually, we know there's a really strong correlation and a link between a failure to tackle poor practice in an organisation, and that therefore creating an environment where more serious abuse can take place. So actually the poor practice stuff really is important, because what it means when we do that is that poor practice is normalised, and that just becomes the way we do things around here. We don't complete risk assessments. We don't involve people in conversations about what is and isn't going to work in a local contextual environment, for example. People rationalise their concerns, so particularly lower level concerns, and the cost of reporting seems greater than the cost of silence. So people stay silent, and what we know is that abuse thrives in an environment where there is silence and where people aren't empowered to speak up. And just finally, the last point that I want to make is around this failure of consistency, that we often set out with good standards and good ideas about what we want to do, but it becomes very inconsistent, and we can have a tendency to rationalize why we are inconsistent. So again, thinking about the delivery of programs, for example, in difficult conflict settings or that kind of emergency setting, we can again start to rationalise why our safeguarding practice isn't as good and why we let things go. And one of our sport for development organisations that we work with in UNICEF UK used this really lovely phrase where they said safeguarding should be a thread, not a blanket. In other words, it's not something you wrap around your organisation once and then don't think about again. But it should thread through every single thing we do, every decision we make, every time we set up a program, every time we think about where resources are going to be directed. We should be thinking about safeguarding, and that should be threaded through the planning and throughout all of the programmatic activities that we do. So thank you. Back to Francisca, and I think we're going to have some time for some questions and comments.
Thank you so much, Sally. Again, really interesting and really useful to think about this. We're going into the question and answer session, and what I'll do is I'll bring I'll bring Francis and Marcus back up, and then we can have some questions from the audience. So just bear with me while I do that. Here we go. So I hope you can all hear. I just wanted to sort of hand over to the audience to see if anyone had any questions specifically. I know that we got a question through the chat actually, and this has actually come from Gareth. So Gareth was asking, to what extent does toxic masculinity from leaders, so including NGO leaders, but also, for example, politicians, business, sport, other leaders, limit the scope for an organization to change its own safeguarding culture? Big question, and I wondered who wants to go first? Sally?
I'll make it. I think it's incredibly limiting. I think any kind of toxic environment is incredibly limiting, and I think I've worked a lot actually in the sports sector around safeguarding. And one of the organisations that helped, one of the networks that helped us in the development with this tool was the Gender and Development Network, and that was incredibly important to us, that we really did see this issue through a gender lens as one of the really significant power dynamics within the sector, but generally, within society and globally, that has an impact. We know that organisations where there are significant numbers of female leadership, that has an impact on the way in which decisions are made and what is and isn't prioritised. So I would think it has a huge impact. And one of the things I think that has been very toxic within our own sector has been that people have moved from some of these, maybe moved from a political, there's been a lot of interconnectedness in the kind of jobs for the boys, really. And I think that can be a really dangerous culture. And that plays into the point that I made about who's being recruited. Because all we will do is perpetuate this culture if we just keep moving the same kind of people around in different organisations because they used to work with you when you were in the other organisation or in politics or wherever. So yeah, I think it's a hugely limiting factor.
Great, thank you, Sally. Marcus or Francis, did you want to come in, or did you have any other thoughts on that?
I think one thing I would add, absolutely endorsing what Sal's been saying, but I think something I would add is we look at employment, but one of the things we also have to think about is the trustees that we have on our boards. Trustees have a really vital role to play in terms of safeguarding, but also in terms of culture. And if you don't have a really strong approach to making sure that your board is inducted into and actively supports and models the culture that you have as an organisation, if you have that disconnect of they're just the board, they're over there, that's fine, they just come in once a quarter and they bring in whatever their own values and issues are and they go away again. If you don't have that really sound approach to culture and sharing of culture between your board and your staff, you run into real problems. Because when it comes to actually doing things like resourcing, safeguarding, resourcing values work, and backing staff up when they have to take difficult decisions, if your board are not sharing your culture, then you are in trouble. And I would add it to what Sal's saying about some of the recruitment that we know has happened. Some brilliant people have come in from outside the sector. I'm not saying they're all scary toxic men, but and I don't think Sally is either. But I do actually think, and we know this from analysis of the makeup of boards of charities and of NGOs, there is a preponderance of, or an excess, I would say, of white middle-aged and older men who often come in, not always clearly, but quite often come in with a really different set of values, a different set of experiences in the workplace, different set of expectations about gender roles, and also about just what is acceptable, what's the rough and tumble of working life in their opinion, versus what we might say is actually unacceptable day-to-day behaviour. And particularly, I think, if they are towards the end of their careers, because I think particularly if you look at the corporate sector, actually cultures have changed massively in the corporate sector in the last 10 or 15 years, and there are many big corporates who are on the leading side of really good cultural change that we can learn from. But if you've already passed through that sector, passed through that job before all that change happened, and you came up the tough way and all of that, actually that kind of attitude can be very toxic. And certainly I have experienced that as a senior leader, sitting with different board members around me at times. So I think that is a real impediment to a healthy culture if you don't tackle your board membership and your board culture in the same way that you would your staff team.
And I think also, Frances, from the culture of the board, I think is really important. I think the diversity of the board is as well. And I say that especially as someone who's earlier in the career. And sometimes when I look at I would love to be a trustee of an organization, but when I look at the requirements, it's almost set out for people at the end of their careers. And very often I just feel like I actually don't have 25 years of experience working in the sector, and therefore, it's not for me. And I think if you have sort of more of a variety of experiences on the board, you actually are much more sensitive to some of those issues, and you're much more sensitive to how different people in organizations experience a culture as well, so that there's not only one culture, but different people experience it in different ways. So actually, I think that's also something that really comes into this. We had another question, so I'll just publish that question so we can all see it. If I can manage, let me just see.
While you're doing that, Francisca, just to add, I think one of the things I've been quite struck by is that all the issues that have been addressed are really crucial, but there's also a notion that sort of the board and senior management really are only visible and only really matter. They only make a difference to the people who are in that strata. And actually what I've been really struck by is how even most junior staff pick up on the cues and the messages that those very senior managers, who are probably completely unaware of their existence, give off. And it really does fundamentally change the way people consider what's acceptable. So those kind of comments, that kind of behavior that becomes public, influences fundamentally how people regard the kind of organization they're in. And very often those very senior people aren't aware of just how dramatic that influence is.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's really important. And I think, where organizations have had cultures and structures which have allowed leaders to consider their own behavior as separate to the behavior that you would expect of others. We've certainly seen, I think that clearly came out in the Save the Children situation, that where they were allowing themselves to behave in ways that actually other people in the organisation wouldn't have been allowed to do. And you're absolutely right. Everybody sees everything.
Yes, that's really nice.
Yeah. And having been in senior leadership roles for a while, having been a chief executive, I was always very conscious that actually everything I did was visible and would have potentially kind of a resonance or a significance that I didn't assume it would. So yeah, people take anything almost as a precedent, I think. So you have to be extremely careful. And humble. I would also say that, to always say to people, I make mistakes all the time, so don't assume everything I do is the right thing to do. I'm just trying my best.
So we had a question from Jane Turner from Sightsavers, who's asking when the tool will be available and will it be freely available to the sector. So the second question, yes, it will be freely available to the sector. The question on when it will be available is that we have all of the content of the tool ready to go, but when we sort of gathered feedback on the tool, we heard loud and clearly from organizations who tested it that it was very useful in terms of the content, but it wasn't very easy to navigate in the way that it was set out, and it was sort of a bit lengthy. It was sort of a PDF version that we had, or Word version. So we're working on a digital tool actually to make it more easily accessible. That digital tool is funded by DFID, who we now obviously know have some delays in putting any new programs through at the moment. So while we wait for them to figure out what's happening with them and the merger with the Foreign Office, we're also waiting to hear on how quickly they are able to sign off any new programs at the moment. We've had assurances that it's coming. They just couldn't tell us when it's coming. So as soon as we have that confirmation, we will reach out to organizations in the sector so that we can, as we develop it into a digital tool, that we can actually make it a useful tool. So there will be an element of testing for organizations once we have a prototype of a digital tool.
And I think Aisha had a question or wanted to make a comment. There's a suggestion that you could come down and Aisha could go.
Okay, let me just do that. Just one moment.
So Aisha, I don't know if you need to click anything to join the podium. There we go.
There you
Brilliant.
go.
Fantastic.
I hope it's working. Can you see me now?
We can't see, but we can hear you loud and clear.
All right. I would appreciate if this camera turns on, because already it's virtual and not been able to be, seeing each other when on the. All right. Let me try one more time. Camera is off. I don't know why it's not turning on. Anyhow, my quest, maybe you can send me a request from your side, maybe perhaps kindly, if that works.
We don't know how to do that, I'm afraid. I'm really sorry.
Okay, all right. So basically, it's a you can call it a question also. Yes, I'm trying to turn on the camera on my side, but it's somehow not working. I mean, I've been clicking on camera off thing, but it's not working. Anyhow, since you're talking about children well-being and in fact empowerment of children, and we're talking about the role of leadership in that, I, being a mother, personally believe that when it comes to empowering children, you need to make sure that their mother is empowered enough to raise empowered children. Why I emphasize on mothers, it's because of the, a long trajectory of empirical evidence of, mothers being more altruistic and more, caring about raising their children and allocation of resources, etc. But presently, unfortunately, while we have this pandemic of COVID, we have this pandemic of women victimization all across the world, and it's prevalent everywhere. So for as long as women remain victimized, uh, because I know that physical victimization or any kind of assault tend to, incapacitate mothers. Their physical to emotional to psychological abilities get, hampered, and they can't perform their duties, may that be as mothers or as workers or to support their children. Now we have this problem on one side, and we have the other problem, which is the poor judicial system in developing countries. Now, women who are abused, they try to, those who are who can, they try to get rid of abusive relationship, and they try to try a good life for their children. But somehow they remain stuck and they stay under persecution because they are victimized and the abusers keep on, abusing them for as long as they can. On the other side, when it comes to children well-being, children again are used as a source to abuse the woman further. So children well-being is, tarnished in a lot many ways because your judicial system cannot ensure maintenance of children, which could be used for their, upbringing, for their well-being, for their education, for empowering them. Empowering sounds a very, big picture. We are stuck in the basic problem, and that is no maintenance by the fathers, which is a very basic right of the child of any child. Number two, seeing the mother victimized and mother feeling incapable of, providing for her children is such a dilemma that we are facing. And unfortunately, despite all resources and technology and advancement in research, most of the developing countries and children from developing countries are still stuck up here. So how can leaders ensure this? What is UNICEF? I would be very much interested in knowing, has UNICEF, do they work on these lines? What do they think leaders can do in this regard? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So I know that there's quite a lot of evidence that shows that if mothers are protected in communities, that's an incredibly strong protective factor for children. And I'm just wondering, Aisha, if you could maybe mute your microphone. Oh, okay, there we go. I think that what UNICEF does is it works with local communities in 190 countries to try and find solutions for risks to children, and working with mothers, working with communities to try and do that jointly. And I think one of the themes that came through in the tool was that really we have to involve people that we are trying to work with, and on behalf of. We need to involve them in the design of safeguarding and in the design of kind of complaints mechanisms, or in the design of the programs that we are trying to deliver on their behalf, so that they actually are context specific and they really make a difference, understanding the different power dynamics, be those gender dynamics or other things in that local community. So really, I think the role of leadership is to make sure that that happens, so that we're not just using a kind of cookie cutter model, thinking that there'll be one size fits all, but really understanding what does safeguarding look like, and what should our programs look like in different settings, so that we take into account the challenges that different groups face.
Thank you, Sally. Francis or Marcus, did you want to come in on that question as well?
I think I would echo what Sally said. And absolutely, Aisha, I think you make a really important point, that actually we don't operate, when we're looking at safeguarding, we don't operate in a vacuum. We operate in the context of a very unjust world, and one where women and girls are significantly and disproportionately disadvantaged, and are also significantly the majority of people who are being abused in the ways that we're describing. And so those power dynamics are enormously important, and safeguarding policy and culture won't protect those women and girls on its own. It is about a significant system change, and certainly, that needs to be front and center in all of the development and humanitarian work that we do. And obviously UNICEF has a strong focus on that. The organisation I work for at Care International certainly has a strong emphasis on that. But yeah, I think it's that contextual question, and the rights of women and girls in all of these situations, very significant. Thank you so much for raising it.
And for what it's worth, and my sector specialist colleagues may know better, but I did a piece of work for Oxfam when I was looking at their processes and procedures, and was really struck by the prominence that they gave to empowering women, almost to the point where part of the conversation we were having was that it was really positive to see that, but that safeguarding wasn't getting the same level of prominence in their literature. But it was the first time I'd really come across that very explicit, very clear commitment to trying to address those issues as part of their core values and purpose.
Thank you. I don't know if you had any other thoughts, Sally, Francis, or Marcus, while we wait to hear from Aisha around the topic. Sorry if I'm putting you on the spot just now.
No, not at all. I mean, I think just picking up, maybe back up again on the issue of gender, I think it was a really super important lens to look through, to think about in terms of the power dynamics. But we recognise it isn't the only power dynamic, and it wasn't the only lens that we wanted to look through. It was there are many others around all the different other types of kind of power dynamics that come into play. For example, the power between adults and children is a really important power dynamic. To do with minority ethnic groups, for example, would be another one. To do with language, disability and ability can be another issue for people in different contexts. So those were really significant, and it became incredibly important actually when we were thinking about the development of the tool.
Thank you, Sally. I think we just got a question, so let me try and publish that. So the question is, how can one know about the roadmap UNICEF plans to follow and can contribute towards making it more region and situation specific?
So I'm not sure really. I'm sorry what you mean about the roadmap, Aisha. I think if there's a specific question around that if you're based in Lahore, as I can see, Lahore School of Economics is coming up for you under your name, then that would be a conversation to have with the regional office in that region. In terms of this tool that we've been presenting on for this panel, then that will be available to anybody who wants to use it online, and so that will therefore, and the idea with it is that people can take it as a principle and they can use it then to apply that in different settings. And we will be wanting to kind of test it out a bit, I think, in terms of how it works in different more local settings, because we recognise that it's been heavily influenced by people in the global north. And so we really want to be very kind of open about that and recognise that whilst we have had the input of people who operate in the global south and have sought their expertise on that, we recognise that there may be some limits to how useful it will feel in some more remote contexts, and so we want to sort of learn from that as we go.
Thank you, Sally. So I think I'm opening it up once more for a final question before we close the panel. So if you have any final questions, any other thoughts, please do so now. Otherwise, just to say, if you have any questions afterwards, you can simply contact us at Bond as well, and we're very happy to pick that up in the future. So you just go to the Bond website, you will find contact details for me, and we're happy to answer any questions that might come up later. I guess with that, I'll just leave it to say thank you again to Sally, Marcus, and Francis for coming and talking about the leadership tool, for developing the leadership tool most of all, and really for sharing your experience about culture and understanding. So I think the last thing that we have is hope that we'll have the tool available really soon so people can start using it and actually make a difference to their organization.